Hi weaving friends, today's video is all about floating selvages. We're going to talk about what a floating selvage is, what it actually does in our weaving project, and then I'm going to show you how to set them up on your loom. Today's video is brought to you by the Online Weaving School. You can choose from a membership or a single purchase class, and whether you're a rigid heddle weaver, a table loom weaver, an inkle loom weaver, or a floor loom weaver, you will find something there for you. I'll leave the link down below so that you can go and check it out. So firstly, to answer what is a floating selvage. If you've been weaving for any length of time, you're sure to have come across this terminology before. And though it sounds a little bit strange, it's actually something that's very simple and extremely useful to the weaver. So a floating selvage is a thread, or usually a pair of threads, that are not actually part of your warp but are introduced to the warp as a replacement selvage. Now when I'm talking about the selvage, I'm talking about your end warp threads on either side of your project. In plain weave, the interlacement that we are doing between shafts 1 and 2, or on a rigid heddle loom, positions heddle up or heddle down, the weft thread will travel around that outer warp edge every time on both sides, going back and forth as you change sheds. But when you get into the territory of doing something that's not a plain weave, what will often happen, and if you don't know this already, you will discover it once you start a non-plain weave project, is that that weft thread will not necessarily travel around every outer edge. Now you do have choices about what you can do to combat this. I'm going to link to an article down below that talks about going around the edges manually when your shuttle doesn't naturally do that. But another really simple and effective way to combat this is to introduce a floating selvage. The floating selvage works by providing that edge thread on both sides so that your shuttle will go around it every single time, providing that you do the actions to ensure that it goes around those threads. The beauty of the floating selvage is because it's not part of the warp, it's not threaded up as part of your warp pattern, it is a free agent, and so you can use it according to how you want to. When you thread it up, and you'll see this in a moment, you place the floating selvage in slot threads, and this makes it free to move up and down, and it's not actually part of the warp. And so on one side, when you take the shuttle through, you will be going over the floating selvage, and when you come out the opposite side, you'll be going under the floating selvage. Then when you send the shuttle back in the opposite direction, you'll be going over the floating selvage. So you've just done a loop around the floating selvage edge, and then back in, and then coming out the opposite side, you'll be going under. So you sort of have this repetitive motion of over, under, over, under, over, under. And if you've never done this before, it might be a little bit confusing, but once you actually start doing it, you'll see it's very simple and it really just becomes part of the weaving for you. It's not something that you really specifically need to think about or concentrate on once you're used to working with it. Now, something that a lot of people wonder about floating selvages is, do you take them out at the end of the warp? Some of you may have seen my Lifeline video that I posted on YouTube some time ago, and that one is all about using a piece of fishing line in order to help keep your edges straighter if you're struggling with that. A floating selvage is not the same thing as doing that, because when you're using the fishing line, you're using it as a guide for straight edges, and then you take it out at the end. But with a floating selvage, it becomes incorporated into your weaving and you don't take it out at the end. It stays. It provides a nice neat edge, and because you coordinate the colours with your warp or your weft, it doesn't look out of place at all. So now that we know what a floating selvage is and why you would bother using one in the first place, I'm going to show you how to set one up on my table loom. It just so happens that I'm at that step of my warp with my table loom at the moment. So I thought it was a great opportunity to just share with you all how I set up my floating selvages on the table loom. But if you're a rigid heddle weaver, I do have a members only class at the Online Weaving School. If you're not a member, what I've done for you is a step-by-step photo tutorial over on my blog. So I'm going to leave the link to that down below, and that's going to have a bit of extra information too, in case you're wondering how I'm going to apply this to my rigid Heddle loom. If you're a floor loom weaver, you set it up in exactly the same way as I'm going to set up on the table loom. So make sure that you check the resources down below that I've mentioned. I put them there so that you have more information to follow and so that none of this is confusing to you. Okay, so let's have a look at how we're going to set it up. First, I want to chat briefly about the tools that you'll need to do this. The tools are very few, so don't worry. We'll need a thread, and there are two ways that you can do your floating selvage. You can either match your thread to your warp. So you can see here, I have a white warp on and I have the very same white thread in order to do this. So it doesn't matter whatever weight of yarn that you're using for your warp, you'll use the same weight for your floating selvage. Now, the choice comes in whether you use the white of the warp, or if I was going to do, let's say I was going to use pink for my weft for the first part of this piece or for the entire piece, I would definitely use the pink weft to do my floating selvages. I'll tell you the reason why I'm using the white instead. This project is going to have multiple weft changes. It's all one piece, but the weft is continuously changing between about four, maybe 5 different colors. And so then I have to make a decision on the floating selvage. I could choose maybe one of the weft colors and just stick with that weft color for the floating selvage for the entirety of the project. But that would really stand out quite a bit against the edge of this white warp if I wasn't continuously using that same weft color. So I want something that's going to blend in. I don't actually want my floating selvage to really stand out, because once you finish the piece, the floating selvages just really become incorporated and become invisible into the piece, and that's what you want. So for this particular project, only because I have multiple weft changes and they're constantly changing, I'm going to use the same color as the warp. Otherwise, I would normally use the same color as the weft. Now, another tool that you'll need is a threading hook. This isn't absolutely necessary to put your floating selvage on. I just find it very simple for putting my thread through the reed. You'll also need a simple pair of scissors. Sharp scissors are always good. And then you're going to need something to weight the floating selvages with, because they're not incorporated into the warp. I'm going to weight them over the back of the loom, and I need something that is about the right weight to do that. Now, I use these S hooks, and I find these really fantastic, not just for floating selvages, but also for broken warp threads, or any time that I need to put a little bit of weight on a thread or a bunch of threads over the back of my loom. Sometimes it's to do with tensioning as well. If I've got a little bit of loose tension, I can use one of these S hooks, and I find them a really fantastic weight because they're not overly heavy and they're not overly light. I find them just right. Now, before I go on, I just want to point out that some weavers prefer to wind their floating selvages and include them in their warp calculations. So you can actually wind your floating selvages on with the rest of your warp and have them as the edge warp threads, but then only thread them through the slots in the reed and not through any heddles. My preference is to do the floating selvages right at the end of dressing my loom, right before I'm going to begin weaving, and to weight them like this. That's just my preference, but I wanted to let you know that that's not the only way to do it. Okay, so let's have a look at how I put my floating selvages on my table loom. I've set my loom up at the edge of a table. When I'm actually weaving, this loom will be turned around towards me, towards where I'm standing right now. But just for the video, I've set it up this way so that we can see what I'm doing. Otherwise, I'd have to try and get around the back of this table and it wouldn't film very well. So that's why I've done that. So when I have the loom actually turned around the opposite direction, the floating selvages will be going over the back of this table instead of in this direction. So to start with, I'm going to pop my yarn at the back of the loom, and you can either pop it on the floor or you can just sit it behind the loom. doesn't matter, but it can be handy to just put it on the floor and then it just feeds off the cone nicely. And it goes over the back cloth beam. And then if we come in closer, we're going to thread it through the reed. So here I am at the side of the loom. This is the edge of my warp, and here are all of my heddles. And then I've got my reed, and I've already dressed the loom completely, tied on. I've done all of that. I'm almost ready to start weaving. And then I'm going to go to the next slot that doesn't have a thread in it. So the slot right here, that has my edge, that has the edge of my actual warp. So I'm going to go to the very next slot next to that one, and that's empty. So I'm going to take my thread, and with my hook, I'm just going to pull that through that empty slot. Now we'll have a look at that from the front. So this is where I've pulled the thread through. If we have a little look here, you can see that that slot right next to it is occupied with the last of my warp threads, and so I'm using the very next available slot that is empty. Then I'm just going to bring that to the front, and I'm going to want a little bit of space to tie this onto my apron rod. So I need to actually bring my warp back a little bit. And that just gives me that little bit of space between my apron rod and the front cloth beam so that I've got room for tying this on. Now, if you're using cardboard separators, I just usually twine the thread in between those two. If you're using waste yarn, you just have the thread going alongside your actual warp threads. And then I bring it to the front apron rod and just tie that on there. It doesn't matter whether you tie it from the top or from the bottom. And you're just going to tie that in a double knot. So that it's on there securely. And that can just be slid over next to the actual warp. Then we go to the back of the loom again. Okay, so what we have now is this floating selvage thread is tied securely to the front, and it's going through the empty slot on the reed, and the rest of the thread is just sitting next to the warp and coming over this back cloth beam. Now what you want is to feed off about the same amount of yarn that you used for your warp. Now you can measure this out or you can eyeball it. It's better to measure it initially if you are just starting out doing this, because it's hard to have an idea of how much warp you've got rolled on there and just to guess it. But because I've done this a bunch of times and I know how long my warp is, I'm going to do a bit of a guesstimate here. So just feed off a bit of yarn, however much you need to be a similar length to your warp. Cut that and then let the rest of it drop to the floor. And this is where the S hook comes in. So what I do is I do a simple slip knot. So a slip knot. And once I've got that loop for my slip knot, I'm going to put my S hook through the loop and then tighten it up. And then I'm just going to let that dangle. So what we have now is that our thread is weighted by this S hook. The rest of the yarn is sitting on the floor. So as I advance my warp forward, obviously this floating selvage yarn is going to go with the warp. It's going to get shorter and shorter. So this hook will be coming up. When you've advanced your warp enough that this is hanging up near the back of the table, then you come back and you take the slip knot out, just like that. Slip knots are great that way. And then you adjust it to another place. Make another slip knot. Pop it through, tighten it up, and then your thread is hanging again, and you've got that lovely amount of weight. Now I'm going to do the exact same what I did on this side to the other side for my second floating selvage. So now you've learned what floating selvages are, how we can use them, and how to actually put them on your loom. Don't forget to check out the resources that I've left for you down below, particularly if you're a rigid Heddle weaver. Have a look at that photo tutorial that I've put together for you. And what you can do is join me in my next video, in which I'm going to show you briefly how you can actually weave with the floating selvages so you know what to do there. Friends, I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to leave me any comments or questions down below and I will respond to you. And until next time, happy weaving.